we're in dire need of support. And I think we have to collectively come together to see how we can do that. And as GiveDirectly, we find because people's experiences are very unique and their needs are very unique, the best way to do that is to give them the choice and the dignity to make a decision as to how they want to help their families, how they want to address their needs, how they want to fight and get out of poverty.
Hey, how are you?
Hey, I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm really, really good. I'm really looking forward to this one because as a bit of a political geek, I listened a lot to the Rest is Politics podcast with your president, Rory Stewart. And he actually was talking about GiveDirectly, and it made me reach out and learn a little bit more about what you do and why. But before we dive into it, I think, why don't I hand over to you to give a great intro into who you are, what you do and why.
Great. And thanks for inviting me to have this conversation with you. I think forums like this are really important to get word across about the importance of cash and what it can unlock. And I'm Esnatt Gondwe-Matekesa. I am currently program manager working with the GiveDirectly team in Malawi. And we work on providing unconditional cash transfers to people that are living in poverty. I work with the team in Malawi, but there are several teams working across over 11 countries globally, all working towards the same, with the same ethos of really combating poverty by giving people dignity and choice through the provision of unconditional cash transfers. So that's basically what we do.
When and why were GiveDirectly founded?
So GiveDirectly was founded, I think, because I wasn't there at that time, but so firstly, it was founded in 2009, I can say, by Paul Newhouse and Michael Fay and some others. And I guess where it came from is this want to be able to just give people what they need. I think these people were academics. They were people that were very grounded in the research, but also they had a lot of experience in the development field. And I think like a lot of people that find their way towards working with GD, they're kind of jaded and they want to make impact. And you worked at Oxfam. So sometimes a lot of the times the donor needs overweigh what is actually needed on the ground. And sometimes you ask yourself, who are we implementing these projects for? There's times where different things are trending and a lot of the proposals are in line with that. Then you sit and you ask, but who is guiding this discourse? Who is guiding this process? Who is leading this charge? And I think for some people, for me included, I can speak for myself. That's why I found my way to GD, because I was just struck by the question, who is determining the development agenda?
Exactly.
And I think really it should go back to the communities. And we know like a lot of donors have a lot of consultation processes with the community, but even with those consultation processes, when you go into a community, there's this, especially in the African context, there's this belief that when you're coming in as a partner, as somebody that works, you will tell me what I need. Right. And I think even having that conversation, even when I was part of those conversations, it was always very, very focused on the same things, very focused on the buzzwords, because people know what people want to hear. And they say that so that they can get help for their communities. So I think I was ready to see somebody that took that out and just went directly to an individual and told them, you know what do you want? And I think that is the spirit that led to the formation of GD. And it's certainly why I joined GD. So we've delivered over 580 million US dollars to over 1.37 million people. We work currently in 11 countries. And I think like that's all just numbers, right? But I think for me, I work with GiveDirectly Malawi. So I don't work with a global team. I work at a country level. So I'm able to see in a very holistic way the impact the transfers have on the everyday person, the everyday woman. I'm a mother, I have a child, and we're recently doing a project in Malawi that's working with pregnant mothers and households that have children under the age of 3. So when you have recipients tell you that, like I can tell you the numbers, but when you have recipients tell you that, your project enabled me to it brought me back dignity because I was able to choose what I wanted for my family. Like a lot of, especially in Malawi, in particular, we had, I don't know, at the beginning of the year, we had Cyclone Anna. It affected a lot of communities here. And then that coupled with, the political economy around the war in Ukraine and what that's doing to global commodities. So the government has predicted that there's going to be high hunger levels this year. So there's a lot of like lean season response that's happening. It's projected that the next couple of months is going to be very hard for a lot of people, especially in my country, in Malawi. And the government has a lot of interventions that they're doing. They're doing lean season response. People are getting more into cash. What we promote constantly is like, instead of giving people fertilizer or giving them things that you think they need, give them the cash and let them determine for themselves what they need, right? Because what I need is different from what you would need. I have kids. Maybe you have an elderly parent. If you give us the same amount of funds, we would want to use it differently. So I think GiveDirectly really prides itself on giving dignity back to recipients and letting them be the voice, that determines what they want. Because I think if you look at neocolonialism, about development as a whole, you ask yourselves, why aren't we making as much strides? Why aren't we making as much progress as we should make? And I think some of it is tied into, in the traditional development sense. And our president said this. We had a meeting with the president of the country this week when Rory came in to visit, that he's tired of perpetuating poverty. Why do we keep fueling poverty? And I think part of the fueling of poverty comes from, fueling a mindset that people believe that they don't know what's best for them. We also do believe that when we send the transfers, it's important to put in mitigation measures to ensure that you're protecting the environment around the people that receive the transfers. So we have a lot of work that we put into safeguarding and to, recipient advocacy. But I think fundamentally giving people that choice, conditionality of our transfers is what's central to our ethos.
Yeah, I think the choice is the key, right? And that's one of the things that made me gravitate towards wanting to set up this call, because I was listening to the Rest is Politics, whereby your president, Rory Stewart, was on talking about GiveDirectly and the work that you do. And being former NGO myself, I used to work at Oxfam. I'm intrigued as to kind of how the model works in its detail. And I agree wholeheartedly that the ability to kind of give people the dignity to choose as to where they want their money to be spent rather than kind of be provided said products or services, I think is a really nice way to approach it. I also have my auditor head on me because I used to work in audit quite a long period of time. So looking at, like, let's say we give a proportion of money to, you said you're based in Malawi. How does that actually flow through, and how do you ensure like checks and balances? Because I agree that it's important to give money and kind of remove some of like the middleman per se, where a lot of the wealth can be extracted and lost. But how do we ensure that money goes to, for example, the building of schools, you mentioned your mum, the provision of goods and services, etc., directly?
Yeah, no, and I think that's a great question. And I think that's something that, we're constantly asked, right? Like, how do you ensure that the development is conducted or is done with having no conditions linked to your transfers, right? And I think for us, like a practical example to give, we have a project that's being implemented in Lilongwe. And recently, one of the recipients with our model, maybe let me just explain this by giving you a just basic outlook of what our model looks like, our operational model. So we go into a community, we have different ways in which we target. Our traditional way of targeting is saturation, where we identify the people we look for communities that are predominantly poor, because our end goal is eradicating poverty or helping to eradicate poverty. So we use different poverty parameter metrics to identify which areas are poor. And then we go to those areas and we aim to saturate. And by saturate, I mean, we identify the people that are from that geographical location and we give to everyone that is eligible within that geographical area. So we don't, like the traditional model, like just highlighting that because we have different ways in which we approach our projects based on the design, but the traditional model and our approach is saturation. So everyone in that area will be saturated with funds. And how do we do that? We go into the communities. We do a process that we call census, and we collect just basic information, ID information. In Malawi, we have national IDs. We collect names, and then we go back into the communities with the second level of enrollment, which we call it registration, where we're confirming the details that were collected at census. And then we proceed to enroll the recipient. And after the recipient is enrolled, we have another process, which we call audit, because, there are a lot of different elements that can come into play. There might be people that are trying to game the system. There might be people that have valid mistakes in some of their documentation. So we have a percentage of people that are audited before payments actually go out. After this process happens, payments go out. When payments go out, we go for follow-up. So we follow up on everybody that received a transfer to just check recipient experience, spend trends, and just if people want to open cases, they can open cases that have come as a result of the transfer. In addition to the follow-ups, we have a call center, which people are told about during enrollment, that they can call the call center to report any issues that may come up. But we also have like a separate team that's firewalled. So this is where your audit background might be excited. We have a separate audit team. Like, I'm part of operations. I don't know who they are. So they go in to just provide checks to see that everything is happening on the up and up internally. So looking at staff and staff interaction, but also externally to mitigate any risk that may come out from external powers. This internal audit team also works with the recipient advocacy team that works to sort of prepare the environment or the community for the transfer. So when the transfers go out, we have these different steps that ensure that, that take away the element of risk that goes into injecting funds into an area. But then some of our recipients have said that because we also go for follow-up, and because at the point of enrollment, we really tell people that this is a one-time transfer. We're not going to come back. So make sure that you spend it on something that you really need. Yeah. And when we go for follow-up, people have said that because you come and follow up and you come and have conversations with us, it makes us want to spend the money in a way that will benefit us and that will show the impact that it has made. So I think these different stages help to ensure that there's some level of follow-up and tracking of what is being done. And that in turn makes communities want to make the most of this opportunity because it doesn't come around often.
So Rory's now your president, right? How's that kind of transition come about, and also how's it going so far?
Oh, it's been great. Rory actually just came to visit Malawi. He's one of the most authentic people that I've met. He had a talk with our team after he had come out of a meeting with the president, talking about, our End of Poverty campaign that we want to launch. And he has a wealth of experience, and he just brings a very different vibe to the team. And again, I think it's very rare to find somebody with that level of expertise that has all the different connections, but still has that sense of humility and authenticity in how he approaches his work. So yeah, it's been great. And we're excited to see the new doors that we can open with him at the head of the organization.
Amazing. One of the topics that I wanted to dive into a little bit more detail is that of the reduction of international aid. So recently in the UK, when Chancellor Rishi Sunak confirmed that the government will be cutting its foreign aid spending, plan to continue to until 2024. And in real terms, that'll take a reduction from 0.7% of gross national income to 0.5%, which represents around 4 to 5 billion, depending on the size of an economy. That's ultimately goes from 14.5 billion to 11.1 billion of spend. I think it's quite key to delve into that in a little bit more detail as to the direct impacts, because we know from a top level thing in the UK, that's a breaking of a manifesto pledge that they made in 2019. But equally, when you delve into the analysis there's a group called One Campaign that estimated that the UK's aid cuts will ultimately lead to things like 7.1 million children losing their education, of which 3.7 million will be girls. 5.3 million women and girls would lose access to modern family planning methods. There's a whole host of stats that I'll put in the comments of this podcast episode. But I just wanted to get your thoughts in respect to the cutting of aid at a time whereby it seems like a moment where we need to be providing more rather than less.
No, 100%. And I think the world, we've experienced several shocks, COVID, the war in Ukraine. There've been consecutive shocks that we've all been feeling. And I think this has sort of pushed different countries into changing their outlook and approach to aid. And I think it's, as you said, it's a time where we really should be coming together. I saw a statistic that the global GDP is at 96 trillion, right? And the global poverty gap is 100 billion, right? So there are funds there. I think we just need to collectively come together and see how to best utilize those funds, because they are going to be ramifications if we don't figure it out. You mentioned about education, but with COVID coming and with climate change, there are a lot of diseases that were eradicated in certain countries that we're seeing come back. We've had an outbreak of polio in Malawi, for example. So I think we're in dire need of support. And I think we have to collectively come together to see how we can do that. And as GiveDirectly, we find, because people's experiences are very unique and their needs are very unique, the best way to do that is to give them the choice and the dignity to make a decision as to how they want to help their families, how they want to address their needs, how they want to fight and get out of poverty.
There is a marked difference in the level of giving. And I think that's why from our end, we're really trying to diversify, because currently we have sponsorship from, foundations, high net worth individuals, some institutional organizations. So it's a varied set of funding streams. But because we're seeing changes in people's priorities, I guess, or outlook, we're seeing that there is a need to really dig deep and identify ways to expand our funding pools or enhance our fundraising. And I think that's, Rory has joined at a very opportune time, because he has a lot of connections that he can tap into that we previously did not have access to. And we're really trying to up our game in bridging those or building those relationships with local donors. So in countries, to see whether we can tap into some of those resources, and trying to really up our game in our content creation to make sure that we're sending the stories out there. We're being creative in the way that we're doing our fundraising, because there are minimal resources. So to make sure that we are in the best place possible, we're best placed to try and generate some support with the content that we're able to create. But yeah, very noted. And it's something that we also have been seeing, and something that we're also alarmed by. The amount we have been able to raise this year is not the same as we did last year. And yeah, so definitely agreeing with you on that point. And those are some of the systems or efforts we've put in place to mitigate that. I think it's a global problem. I think not only us, but a lot of charities or NGOs or INGOs are feeling that pinch. So there's more of a battle for very limited resources.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in which case, I think it's also a good opportunity to talk about other means of funding as well. So if you look at things like, we had recently on the podcast a business called Circa 5000, which is very, very much focused on investments for people and planet. And they make, rather than kind of traditional means, they make a direct assessment of the impact of a company via, again, similarly, an audit-esque process to assess their true impacts. And then if they are deemed to be impactful, then they are provided as a means onto that platform. And people can invest directly into causes, companies, etc., that they truly believe in. And I'm encouraged by that, because we also had another conversation with a business called Gratitude not too long ago as well, which essentially they allow gamers, they operate in the computer game sphere, and they essentially allow gamers to receive cashback from in-game purchasing and donate that directly to environmental, conservation and social NGOs. And, if we're looking at the sums of money that we're talking about in the industry, I'm from a gaming background. So from a figures perspective, at this point in time, the industry's worth 235 billion. And it's expected to be worth 321 billion by 2026. There's, players wise, there's, I think, 3.24 billion gamers globally, with a year-on-year growth of 60% of in-game purchasing over the last 3 years. So there's these huge pots of money. And it's just about, for me, it's about progressive partnerships for change, because we could all do good alone, but, when we come together, we can do great things.
100%. Before I came to GD, I was into partnerships and partnership development with the government. And I think that was the key thing. Progressive partnerships for change is really important, and using different, the private sector, public sector, and really promoting those relationships. What was the name of this organization that you were talking about? The last one, I got the circa 5,000, but the last one that you mentioned?
Gratitude. I can make the introductions, don't worry.
That will be great. I think it will be great to introduce them to our growth team, because I think these are this is what we're looking for. I think it's just been a lot of consecutive bad luck with COVID, and then the war, and then for us in sub-Saharan Africa, we had the cyclones, which have all been sort of. There's just been a lot of consecutive horrors coming up, and horrors might be an extra, but I think there's no other word for it. I think for a lot of people, it has had very horrific results. We recently in Malawi, we had eradicated polio, but it's now come back. Cholera cases are rising, and people attribute that to the changing climate situation. So I think there's been so many ripple effects that we have to re-strategize. We have to become more creative with the ways that we raise funds or raise awareness of our different causes. So I would really appreciate a link, and I think that's great.
Happy to do so, because as I mentioned earlier, I used to work at Oxfam, so looking at the impacts of the coronavirus, I remember reading a little while ago that there was around 41% increase in direct debit cancellation for UK charity donations, which is huge. So when people are starting to feel the pinch, they naturally look to reduce external direct debits, etc., where possible. But the impact that we're seeing at the moment, the horrors that we're seeing here, this is a point in time when we should be digging deeper into our pockets to provide for those that really need it. And it's understanding that we're all in this challenge together, and ultimately the ability to care for others and empathize for others and support others, to have that level of, as you said, dignity in respect to how they choose to invest and where they want fundings to go to. I think there's a lot of good that can be done at this moment in time, but it's just about putting those connection points together to make sure people that can help do help.
100%.
So we talked about how you generate funds. We've talked about where you guys are located and the sums of money that you have to play with. But looking at impact, since you guys have been going, some of the case studies that you've been able to kind of point to and work that you've done in the past.
Yeah, sure. So I think one, looking at impact, I think we really pride ourselves on it in as much as we do our operations, and I'll speak to that impact in a minute. We also want to work towards building the body of literature to promote cash transfers and how they can be impactful in different developmental settings, but also developmental thematic areas. So far, and in terms of impact on that research point, we've run 19 RCTs on our programs that help to sort of map the impact and the feasibility of cash and what cash designs are more effective, so as to build the literature. So I think that's a major thing to our contribution to the cash dialogue and cash framework as a whole. In regards to our impact in countries, we've worked in 12 countries. We've run, we've secured 950 million for recipients and delivered 580 million in the past decade. So that's a lot of cash going out. But in terms of specific case studies, again, I would urge to speak more to the case studies in Malawi, because I can speak to them with more gusto, and because I've seen them with my own eyes as well.
Yeah.
During COVID, we partnered with community-based organizations to provide cash as a form of recovery in peri-urban areas. And the other day we partnered with this organization that worked with women that have been victims of violence. And they, during COVID, a lot of gender-based violence was heightened, and our target, the organization was working with women. So with the transfers, and we did this in end of 2019, beginning 2020. And last week, one of the women sent a voice note to the woman that runs this organization. And she was saying that I was able to get 9 pigs, and I've started my business, or I currently have 9 pigs from the funds that I received. I was able to pay for my child's school fees. So we saw a lot of like cash expenses, like things to sustain livelihoods, but we also saw people putting the money towards a business, like this woman with the pigs. And there was another one that had always wanted to open a shop, and she didn't have the capital to start that off with. And she was able to do that with these transfers. We recently we started implementing in Malawi in 2019, and we went back to the first community we went to this year. So this is 3+ years later. Yeah. And this man where we went, at the time where he received his transfer, he, improved his house. But I think for me, what stood out is he bought 2 goats. And when we went there, he had 14 goats. And then he had purchased 2 cows. They were small cows, so he was waiting for them to grow. And he had a rice field. So he was still complaining because that was one of the areas that was hit hard by by Cyclone Anna, the tropical storm Anna. And he still wanted like additional support. But then the fact that he had something to fall back on, he expressed that he was never truly without, even with the shocks. The rains delayed, and then when they came, that cyclone hit. So people's farming year was really bad. So seeing his ability to be resilient, even in the face of all of those shocks, to me, I think that speaks to tremendous impact on the whole message of, building resilience. We do it through various projects where we run resilience campaigns, we do trainings. And this was a person which we didn't do any of those things, but he was able to use whatever research or tools he had at his disposal in the community with the extension workers to make a plan for himself that was able to see him through some hard times. And that's one example that speaks to many. But for me, in terms of impact, those are some of the few case studies that I would draw upon.
And in respect to how do you decide to whom to give the cash transfers, and also to what amounts are people provided? And is it like a one-time thing, or is it ongoing relief?
So we have different projects and different designs based on different needs, right? Like we have, large sum projects that we do, which have a big amount that we give to recipients based on that specific design. And they usually receive 1/2 of the transfer, and then there's a break in between for follow-up, and then they receive the other part later on. And that's a one-time grant, and it's a larger amount. But then we have basic income projects, which are like they receive smaller transfers over a longer period of time. And the distinction between these is just depending on the needs in that particular area and the design of that particular program. And how we choose who will get the transfers is, as I made a bit of reference to this before, our traditional approach is to saturate. So if we identify an area is one of the poorest areas, then we'll take our funds and we'll saturate that area. It's more often than not with the large sum projects. But then there've been some projects that have been targeted. As I mentioned, we did some emergency response. So we're targeting people that have been victims of, a certain emergency catastrophe. So with the cyclone, we supported them, and it was targeted towards them. And we've also, like with the project I'm telling you about targeting women and caregivers of childbearing age that have children under the age of 5. That's some of our targeted approaches, but our rule of our standard approach, I guess, is to saturate and to provide these large sum projects, because we've seen that through our studies that has a greater impact.
And is there any preconditions that you apply upon what people can have or qualify in order to get a transfer, and also how are transfers made?
So yeah, we don't apply any conditions, but we've been doing, especially this year in the case of Malawi, we've been doing a lot of cash plus programs. So we have cash, and we work with other partners that are implemented in the area in a way in which we're not associated. So we would go into the communities as two different organizations, but we're going there because we know another organization is doing certain interventions that we want cash to complement. So we don't directly say this is conditional or contingent on you doing the A, B, C, and D, but because we're partnering with a partner that does have interventions in that area, that's kind of how we're leaning into the plus aspect of our cash transfers.
Exactly. And I remember even the time when I was at Oxfam, we were trying to implement something called the Robin Hood tax, where the campaign itself was proposed to set taxes on a range of financial transactions. And the rate would vary, but it would averagely be around 0.05%. And that money would go into a pot to kind of alleviate global poverty. And it's interesting because, like, when you look at the availability of funds, they are available. It's just figuring out actually the logistics behind it, and also like the pots of wealth that's available. So if we kind of look at now, like two of the biggest things that struck me recently, I remember reading a Treasury document, because as I say, I'm a political geek. So I was reading this Treasury document, and it talked about how there was 170 billion available via a windfall tax over the next 2 years. And then I read another HMRC document that was talking about how there's roughly around 850 billion available in tax havens and offshore. And you're looking at that volume of money, and you're looking at the rising levels of interest and the rising levels of inequality. And there comes a time where we need to support people rather than perpetuate cycles of profit.
No, 100%. I like it. Perpetuating cycles of profit. I think poverty in some ways it's become almost a business. I think it shouldn't be, because when you look at the faces of poverty, I think you're just called out. And I think we need to call each other out a bit.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's just that honest conversation, right? In respect to these are the challenges that we face, but equally these challenges can be remediated, and these are the potential solutions available to us. And it's just showing people that there is another way. And this is why I was like keen to jump on a call with you and like learn a little bit more about what GiveDirectly are doing, because I think it's these new ways of giving people dignity and giving people the ability to choose where the money goes and how the money flows, that's going to really provide lasting impact, and hopefully will go a long way towards alleviating global poverty. And we talked about this a little bit earlier in the podcast in respect to like the wealth of funds that are available via, we talked briefly about a windfall tax being 170 billion, or HMRC knowing that 850 billion, which represents around 6% of the UK's total net income wealth, is held in tax havens. So I think it reminds me a lot of a conversation we had with the patriotic millionaires a little while ago, back in January. In respect to tax, those with the broadest shoulders should be paying a little bit more. And also the discussion in respect to where money can be generated from, because as you said, there is an abundance available. It's just figuring out how and where and to what mechanisms and do we implement to allow for the flow of money to take place.
100%. Totally agree. Totally aligned with you on that.
Another question I wanted to ask was in respect to government as a whole, in respect to A, the important role that they play, and also B, within the wider context.
I think government is one of the most strategic partnerships that we have. They've been instrumental to our work in Rwanda, to our work in Malawi. And if you want to implement certain projects at scale, it's really important to work with them towards that, because fundamentally they build and they cultivate the structures that we would need to work with to eradicate poverty at scale. So I feel that it's really important in building partnerships and building relationships to start with relationships with government, and to purposefully engage, and not just in a token manner, but to purposefully engage and work with structures to ensure that we're able to work collectively towards a goal. In a way that supports the project as a whole and does not undermine collective approaches.
to purposely engage. I love that. And I think it's so true that it reminds me of a book I was reading recently by Ari Wallach. It's called Long Path. And it's ultimately about becoming the ancestors our future descendants need. And I think looking at kind of the viewpoint of it, looking at the viewpoint of it is a long path. It's a long journey that we're going to have to take. But equally, we have to strive towards a long path rather than take these perpetual shortcuts. And because if you look at the statistics, inequality is rising, inflation is rising, all of the traditional indicators, negative issues that occur within society are right in front of us. We see the challenges, but it cannot be solved alone. It has to be solved together. So I encourage anybody that's listening to this podcast to kind of reach out to be part of the conversation and ultimately look towards building these progressive partnerships of change, because that's ultimately how we'll get to the end goal. That's ultimately how we'll get to the long path and leave a legacy behind that is for the benefit of future generations. So
exactly. I love that. Being the ancestors that our future generations need. I love that.
We've talked a lot about the economic impacts. We've talked about the cutting of aid. We've talked a little bit more about GiveDirectly as a whole. But in respect to impacts, we mentioned a little earlier about some case studies, but some impacts, some statistics that we may be able to kind of leave with our audience to have a little bit more awareness of the what and the how and the what takes place.
For sure. And I think I think some two countries to highlight, which I have had the opportunity to work with, is Malawi, because that's where I'm from and that's where I currently reside, and Rwanda. Two very good examples of countries and that have had a huge impact, or that have felt a huge impact from the cash. In Rwanda, we saw of the recipients that received transfers, 96% of them spent it on food, 72% on health and sanitary apparatus, and 45% on education. So we're seeing cash having an impact on social services and access to these services in ways that sometimes traditional projects may struggle. In Malawi, we've seen 80% of our recipients that were victims of Cyclone Anna using the funds to improve their homes within an emergency context. We've seen in Malawi, again, 60% of recipients purchasing livestock that they then use for businesses. In Rwanda, 91% on agriculture and livestock. So people are finding ways to make the biggest impact on their lives with the cash. And the evidence shows that the funds are being used in these ways that are not only creative, but are very impactful.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess to close out, firstly, thank you so much for sharing such amazing insight. It's been an absolutely awesome episode. But to close out, what does the future hold for GiveDirectly? What are your kind of key goals in the short, medium, and long term? And kind of bearing in mind some of the challenges that we're all about to face just down the road, what would your advice be to our listeners keen to do a little bit more?
Well, I think I'll split that up, right? In terms of GiveDirectly, I know we're really working towards finding creative ways to really grapple with and fight poverty, so we can get to the point. It's the UN's number one goal, wanting to eradicate poverty, and GiveDirectly really wants to be part of that process. So I think strategically, that's something that we're looking to do, and looking to form partnerships, form relationships that will enable us to do that at scale. And in terms of just thoughts for moving forward, I feel strongly that what we've been dealt the past 3 years or two to say, I think it's important for us to, instead of to fight the response of going into ourselves, going into our countries, going into our bubbles, and really open our minds, our hands, our abilities, our experiences to each other so that we can move forward together. I think more than ever, the world needs to collectively come together and not be, not have very fragmented approaches to the general good. I think we have to work together, and we have to develop those partnerships, develop those relationships, develop those structures that will enable us to do so. And I think cash and organizations like GiveDirectly that have gained experience, but also expertise in delivering cash, we should be involved in those conversations, and we're willing to be involved in those conversations because fundamentally we're all working towards the same goal. We're just doing it in different ways.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Purpose Made podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to Purpose Made wherever you normally get your podcasts to hear the latest news and views. You can also find and follow us on Instagram, LinkedIn and Twitter, or contact Peter directly to connect, inquire about Purpose Made, or request to be featured on the podcast. We look forward to welcoming you back soon for another episode.